On the point about Capex, it's a good question that you asked. Look, as a headline, that's clearly been the thrust, both last year as well as this year, when they pushed it to 5.5 lakh crore and this time to 7.5 lakh crore, which is a dramatic increase. Clearly, the message is, listen, we've got to push Capex, which is great. Nobody can argue with that. There are some nuances, though. As you rightly pointed out, this year's Capex of 6 whatever lakh crores includes that cleaning up of the Air India situation. The fact that they've had to infuse equity to clean up the books and therefore hand it over to the buyer has gone in as a Capex, which is strictly not a productive Capex in that sense. It's a sunk cost, which is being, the sins of the past are being washed in some sense. For the next year, Ira, what I notice is that if you look at the extra borrowings of the PSUs, you have extra budgetary resources for both NHAI as well as for BSNL. You're seeing a substantial reduction in the off-balance sheet type borrowings showing up in that report. So 65,000 crores of NHAI debt vanishes the next year. 15,000 crore of BSNL debt also disappears. So both put together, it appears that the government is actually continuing with the cleanup that it's been doing over the last 3 fiscal years. FCI the last year, Air India to some extent this year, and continuing with that trend, bringing down the off-balance sheet items, taking some of them onto their own books. In that sense, it's a good issue. I think, Ira, we've been arguing about this for ages, come clean on the real kind of math. So off-balance sheet items are being taken on board. You could argue, though, that this is not really fresh capital expenditure being initiated by the government. So 80,000 crores, I think, is just cleaning up the books, pushing it from what's already been booked in NHAI and BSNL onto the books of the central government, not really additional. So to that extent, I would say 7.5 minus 0.8, 6.7 is probably the true Capex. Now, there's another element, which is the 1 lakh crore, which the center has promised as a loan to the states in order for Capex to be pushed out there. I don't have a problem with that. As long as it's fresh money going out, and states, by the way, undertake more Capex than the center does. So as long as that's fresh money being sent to the states for them to deploy, I don't have a problem. I think that's genuine Capex in that sense. But this 80,000 crores, I think, is a cleanup of the past. Good, but not fresh Capex, productive Capex.
Just I'm going to ask you a follow-up there. So you're saying that in that 7.5 on capital account number, there could be an 80,000 component, which is cleaning up of past, and that 1 lakh crore, which is going to states, is also part of that 7.5?
So I'm going to defer to Kaushik, who probably understands the books better than I do. But my own sense is, yes, I think that 1 lakh crore is part of the 7.5 lakh crore and is getting counted as Capex, which is probably right. You are, after all, pushing out there. But the confusion there, Ira, which I've not been able to verify, to be honest. Look, for the 1.59, 1.6 lakh crore compensation cess, that went as a back-to-back borrowing and was not really recorded as part of the fiscal deficit.
Yeah.
To that extent, by looking at least glancing, I'll go through it tonight and I'll know the answer by tomorrow morning, but at least glancing through, I couldn't see that kind of an adjustment being done. So it did look to me that this 1 lakh crore is being recognized as a Capex in that sense. But I'll defer to Kaushik in case he has taken a look and see.
Kaushik, both of those are very interesting points. You want to weigh in?
No, so if what Ananth is saying, that 80,000 crore, if it is for the extra budgetary items which have been taken on the balance sheet this year, then you're still talking about 6.7, which you should compare with not 6 but 5 trillion of FY22. 5.5, sorry, instead of 6, 5.5. So 5.5 going up to 6.75 is also a big amount. I mean, remember, before 5.5, we used to work with 4.2 or 4 trillion. And, my worry is whether you have the absorptive capacity or the government can actually spend, close to 7 trillion in FY23. That will be the biggest challenge. And, you remember that during the second wave, April, June, the government could not function properly because a lot of people fell sick, and you had to wait for July, September. Then the expenditure started increasing. So to that extent, the question would be whether you will be able to spend the entire amount. And to the second part, whether 1 trillion of the state-related loan, because they're calling it probably loan, so it should not be part of this expenditure. I don't know how they would account for it, whether it will be over and above this amount. That has not been made clear. But I guess, whichever way you slice and dice, you would see that the capital expenditure thrust is genuine. And they genuinely wanted to clear this, bring this transparency and not, looking at extra budgetary resources, because at the end of the day, the one number which will not lie to you is the public debt GDP ratio, because even if you don't show it as fiscal deficit, you have to incur the debt obligation. So that debt GDP had gone up to close to 88-90% in FY21, should be around 86% by now. It's still very high compared to the 72%. So I think the focus is more on pushing capital expenditure as much as you can, while keeping revenue expenditure, which is 81% of the total expenditure. All these interest payments, defense subsidies, they make up 50% of total expenditure. That is estimated to remain more or less flat, or 0.9% growth. So that's why the revenue deficit to fiscal deficit ratio, which I was telling you about the quality of fiscal spending, is looking like, is estimated at 59.6%. So these are good from a medium-term perspective, that the kind of support that you'll have probably will not, stoke inflation. We already have concerns about inflation. So the capital expenditure probably could have a bigger multiplier impact of jobs and employment. And what it could also do is probably kind of incentivize the private sector to come with their investments from second half FY23, when the government starts spending more. So I remain optimistic on the capital expenditure front, irrespective of the number related discussion that we are having at this stage.